And joining me now to discuss some of the key issues for 2016 is Kristina Butts. Kristina, thanks for coming to the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You and your team have had an incredibly busy year this year. Tell us about some of the key accomplishments.
So the omnibus, which was the end-of-year spending package, really had a lot of priorities for NCBA. We saw tax reform with tax extenders being made permanent, kind of included in that package. We've also taken care of country of origin labeling from a mandatory standpoint, was fully repealed, which you might remember that the House had a pretty big vote back in June with 300 members of Congress fully supporting that, setting us up in a very bad trade position if Congress didn't take action before the end of the year. So the omnibus included language to fully repeal that. The omnibus also included language that is very important on nutrition, on dietary guidelines, ensuring that Congress does play a true oversight role and assuring the scientific process that the agencies go through is actually able to utilize and go through that process. And then also on the animal health front, just putting some procedures in place at the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service to ensure that countries that want to bring their cattle or their beef exports into our country have a certain criteria set forward that's public and available. So lots of big wins that took several years to kind of get to that point, but a very profitable and a very great 2015 for cattle producers.
And a lot of key wins for the industry for
Absolutely.
sure. So let's talk 2016. In addition to the presidential elections, what do we have to look forward to from a political and regulatory basis?
So anytime you have an election year, it's a little bit interesting in Washington because that really shortens the time period as to when you can actually move things forward. So obviously on the nutrition front, we started off 2016 with the dietary guidelines, which were really great. Lean meat was added back into what the agencies consider a healthy dietary pattern. Thanks to the oversight with Congress and the involvement from the secretaries as well, the final guidelines stayed focused on nutrition and health and didn't bring in outside topics that were not pertinent to what the committee was supposed to look at. And then statements about overconsumption of red meat were actually taken back when the agency reviewed their own consumption data to show that the protein food group is one of the few consumed within the daily recommended values of the 2010 dietary guidelines. So 2016 is off to a great start on the nutrition front. I think we're very appreciative that the secretaries utilized a lot of the science that was submitted through the comment period and the process to really make sure the final document is based on science. We didn't have a huge win on the WOTUS front and defunding that with the end-of-year spending bill, so we're looking for ways on waters of the United States to push back EPA, whether that's defunding from an appropriation standpoint or finding ways to move and get 3 more key votes in the Senate to pass S1140, their legislation to kind of force EPA to go back to the drawing board and have stakeholders come in to start talking about that regulation. And then obviously we're using NCBA membership dollars to file a lawsuit and pursue a lawsuit against the EPA with the Public Lands Council. So that's going to be a big focus as well moving forward into 2016 for NCBA.
I'm glad to hear we're not giving up on that issue for sure.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And you know, it's unfortunate because just last week the president vetoed, 2 congressional review acts that the House and the Senate passed in a bipartisan manner that basically would prohibit EPA from ever promulgating any future rule that actually looked like the final WOTUS rule that we saw. So unfortunately, he really didn't stand up for farmers and ranchers. He went against members of his own party who said EPA has overreached here. And we're hopeful in the very near future the House Agriculture Committee will have the administrator in front of the committee and we'll be able to kind of answer some of these questions and start asking some heavier hitting questions, hopefully lining us up for some successes later this year.
That's good. We talk a lot about lobbying efforts and what you're doing from a regulatory environment. What people may be surprised by is some of the educational efforts you have in DC. Tell us more about that.
Absolutely. So it actually takes several years or months of education before we can get to a place to have members of Congress feel certain on how they want to vote on a particular issue. So several years ago, NCBA created a Beef 101 program, and for most of the listeners and people watching and you and I coming from the industry, it's going to sound really kind of mundane, but we take complicated terms and verbiage in our industry and just topics, E. coli, 0157H7, what is that? And what does that mean from an industry standpoint and a regulatory standpoint? Antibiotics, how do we use them as an industry? So what we do is bring in producers, so people involved in the industry every single day to Capitol Hill, fly them to Washington and have them speak to congressional staff. And then 2 years ago, we expanded this educational opportunity with the Food and Drug Administration. So the overseers of all animal health technologies except for vaccines. And every other month we have a partnership with FDA where we have technical staff, veterinarians, animal health experts, cattle producers, cattle women coming to Washington and talking about a lot of these efforts. And then back in July, because a lot of the interest around antibiotics with the White House and the advisory committee that the president has established, we started reaching out to the White House and talking to them on antibiotics and nutrition and on environmental issues. And we're going to continue those efforts on the educational front because, again, most of these members in Washington, they have a really hard time trying to correlate what we're writing on paper and how that has a direct impact or may not have a direct impact on producers actually on the land every single day. So bringing producers to Washington is really key to help give them that personal perspective.
That's outstanding. One last question. As you talk to producers, what would you tell our viewers about how they can stay abreast and involved with what's going on in DC?
So it's really important to make sure you're staying up to speed on what issues are being discussed in Congress. And I think one of the best ways to do that is being a member of groups like NCBA and getting on our e-newsletters and alerts. So as issues come forward, we can kind of send out an email blast and let members know that it's time for them to engage on Capitol Hill or to submit comments on the regulatory side. But it's also really important to have that relationship with members of Congress and their congressional staff. So finding time to come to Washington, NCBA's legislative conference is a great opportunity for that. Or when members of Congress are back home in their states, going to town hall meetings or inviting them to come out to your family's operation, just helping them get the perspective of the industry and what we do is always really great. And this year is going to be really important too, because not only is it a congressional election year, it's a presidential election year. And there's going to be a lot of key issues that we want to move forward in a limited time frame in Washington. And the reason why NCBA is successful is because of our membership. It's our grassroots. I'm up there every day advocating on their behalf, but when I make that phone call to our producers and they make the phone calls in and they flood them with emails, that really helps us close the deal and get those members where they need to be to support the industry.
Outstanding. Thanks so much for all you and the rest of the team do for us all in Washington, D.C.
Thank you.